Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/Security Weekly and sign up for the Recorded Future Cyber Daily. Every day, you'll receive an email with the top results for trending technical indicators, cyber news, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more. Subscribe today and stay ahead of cyber attacks. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs. Their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Ocean. That's where I used to work, actually, at Ocean. They're hosting a conference on cybersecurity in Rhode Island. Cybersecurity Exchange Day on March 13th at the O'Hare Academic Building at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. That sounds familiar, Patrick.
I think that's where Layer 8 conference was last year.
It, in fact, was, my friend. You can register now at ocean.org/events. Some jackass by the name of Paul Asadorian, I think, is giving the keynote, so you may want to check that out, I guess.
I think somebody else is speaking there, too.
Are you speaking there, too?
I'm speaking there, too. This is going to be awesome. I can't wait.
Speak at the same conference again.
Right.
Like the fourth or fifth time.
Yeah.
One time you spoke for me, which was awesome.
Yeah. That was the best. I'm just sitting there in the audience, and the organizer comes over, and he's like, Paul's not here. Can you step in? I'm like, yeah. So I go up, and I talk about something. I don't even know what. Paul calls me a little while later. He's like, I'm so sorry, man.
Just total miscommunication. My fault completely. Just forgot to show up. It happens. It happens.
Whoops. Hey, remember that time you had to speak for John? At DerbyCon? John Smith?
Yeah, I did. Well, John he had travel issues.
Right, but
travel issues, so he says.
Yeah, the best part of it was that he sent you slides and they were all in Prezi format.
Mm.
So it's just a picture and you had
no idea. It was like playing slideshare roulette.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah, it's slideshare roulette.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's actually fun.
Secure World Boston is hosting their 15th annual conference March 27th through the 28th. Heinz Convention Center. Security Weekly listeners get $100 off by visiting secureworldexpo.com and using the code SecurityWeekly. All righty. Oh, this is my technical segment, enterprise-ish network security. I say ish because as I was going through building this stuff, I'm like, this is really like some enterprise level features. Now it's not really like there's no like core routing and switching and fancy firewalls and all that stuff and 10,000 or plus endpoints. However, what I built, I was actually like telling some people about it. They're like, that's actually pretty cool. How much did that cost you? I'm like, you could build this for like less than $1,000
and a week of your life.
Yeah.
So it's enterprise-ish at the cost of like consumer-ish.
Yes, exactly. I mean, even less than some consumer.
My Switch costs more than $1,000.
Right? Like some of the consumer stuff is really expensive. So if you're on the consumer side, this is like a really high-end consumer network or small business network at a really low cost. And I did do the wireless with Ubiquity, and if you do hang one, Ubiquity AP, they're like $79 now. They support 802.1Q trunking. Like it's
pretty impressive.
And they're gig, and they work really well.
So it was enterprise-ish when you were all
That's why I said enterprise-ish. And what really did it, we were upgrading our bandwidth, and we actually have multiple connections to the internet now. And that's what sparked this whole thing, was me trying to figure out how to make use of each link. Oh, by the way, now we have a gig to the internet, which means everything else, and those of you that have a gig at home or at work, right, know that everything else behind that now has to be up to spec. Like there's no more cheating. Like, oh, there's a category 5 cable running somewhere. Like that's gonna now.
I only have a 100 meg switch. It's fine.
It's
but my limits to the
fine.
internet at
What could go wrong?
75.
Right? Yeah, it ups your game. So, and the other thing that Matt Alderman likes to point out is now that we have a CEO, one of the things I tasked the CEO with is come up with a budget. So me being the hacker, now when Matt says the budget, I want to see like how far under the budget that I can come and still accomplish maybe even more than what I had set out to do while still coming way under budget. Like I'm hacking the system in a good way. I mean, you
Well,
run a
if you
company,
get-
Harry. Like, why not come way under
Yeah, but
budget?
you don't
right?
get commission for the savings. That's the thing that sucks about it.
I do. Well, I'm part owner of the company, so it helps. I mean, you know, like more profit helps if you're the owner of the
Yeah,
company.
it's your
right?
money.
Yeah. So that's really what sparked this whole thing, full transparency. And so I set out to build some stuff. Now, the first thing I'll talk about are the firewalls. And these were featured a long time ago when Greg Foss came on the show from Logarithm, and he talked about these Qotom firewalls. Now, I will warn you, these most of the time ship directly from China, like literally on the slow boat. DHL tries to deliver them. But I challenge you to find your firewall hardware vendor and prove to me that at least some of the components aren't manufactured in China.
What could go wrong?
Right? It's kind of scary when your entire firewall in a box comes from China.
Right. It's
so
literally fresh off the boat.
they're probably listening to me like right now, like ni hao. There's a listening device in here. It's cool.
Wow.
It built right in. It's great. But no, these are cool because one reason they're fanless, and the entire case is the heatsink, which is nice. Now, I did, in future segments, I'll talk about some of the other add-ons that I bought. There are some USB-powered fans that you can sit on top of these to help, the heat come off of them. And in our server closet, that's probably a good thing because it runs a little hot. It's like a balmy 80 degrees in there most of the time, which is nice if you want to warm up in the winter. So there are some add-ons. So these come with 4 gig Ethernet ports, some USB ports. You can do VGA serial or a combination thereof. Yeah, that's how you install it initially.
State of the art. Right?
It's
Wow.
state of the art.
Wow, 2007 called and wants to.
I don't know why. And
Well, it could be CGA.
It's a good point. I don't know why they did that instead of HDMI, but that's the way these come. Maybe it was
It's probably cheaper on the chipset.
cheaper to do it, and you only
You're going to do it once.
exactly what Harry said. You use it once to install the OS. You put pfSense or OPNSense on a thumb drive. You install it, and then
done.
you're off.
The only kicker is kind of like getting a DVD now in the mail. You have to find the hardware to plug it in to do that one time. But
the thing that does suck without this, some of my other models have HDMI and a serial console, so it will vary. Is if I wanted to have a serial console server somewhere, I wouldn't be able to do that necessarily with VGA, although I haven't looked into the options there. The kicker with that is, though, it has to hit the network somewhere, so designing, to have that level of failover is kind of, I guess I could have a separate internet connection for that. Anyway, so these are really cool. This one's actually not the one in the show notes. The one in the show notes is really awesome. It's a little beefier. It's 16 gigs of RAM, or 8 gigs of RAM with a 16 gig SSD. This one that I'm holding is actually the one for my house. It's 8 gigs of RAM with a 64 gig SSD. Your total cost on this one's $251, and it ships Prime. So this one actually shipped from, I believe, within the U.S. This one didn't come directly from China, so this was already pre-imported.
It may have been imported and being serviced by Amazon.
Yeah, and it's an Intel processor, again, with full gig. Now, in my testing, I will say with this hardware, I've tested both OPNSense and pfSense. These things will push gig without breaking a sweat. I mean, and I'm monitoring, I'll talk about my monitoring, but I'm monitoring CPU temperature, memory, the whole thing. Like, it barely breaks a sweat when you're pushing full gig. And I know that's true because when we push all our shows up to the internet, we're consuming a lot of bandwidth. We were exceeding our 150 pipe, which I didn't realize. Every time we publish a show, we're using our entire internet pipe. Oof. So when we push, it's more like 300 meg roughly. So the gig was really helpful, and these things do great. And they run about $250 to $300, depending on your options. And so I really like them. A lot of the models also have Wi-Fi on them. I chose a different solution for Wi-Fi. Having 4 ports is nice because if you've got multiple internets, an internal network, and a Wi-Fi, and or a connection to a high availability firewall, that's all possible. pfSense, OPNSense, and Ubiquity, most Ubiquity gear, at least the Unify products I'm using, also support 802.1q trunking, which means I don't necessarily have to burn a port for my Wi-Fi. I can use VLANs and put that on another port and write firewall rules accordingly with virtual interfaces, which is nice. So that's, there's another, sorry, Jeff, there's another manufacturer that looks to be more based in the US. It's Protecti, something like that. There is another manufacturer, which I'll cover on a different show. If you look on Amazon, you'll see some of their devices. Yeah, it's Protectly is the other provider. They're a little more expensive, but essentially the same design. You know, heatsink, Intel processor. You can get 2 to this one that I'm looking at has 6 gig ports on it, and that one is $500. So, Joff?
Oh, it's just really funny that the one that I got, Paul, which is kind of very, very similar box, I actually just sent a picture to you, is
oh yeah,
the Protectly.
Protectly, sure, yep.
Which is 8 gig RAM, 128 gig mSATA SSD. But it's a perfect little footprint, that size box to implement, you know, whatever you want to implement on there. In my case, I did custom Ubuntu.
There you go.
Linux on it, but you know, I think the footprint with the 4 NICs on it and Intel processor, gig NICs, ability to do .1Q, it's a nice flexible little box.
Absolutely. Now, I did at some point kind of realize the need for an actual real Cisco switch. I think there's a lot of gear that you can buy, you know, off the shelf, cheaper gear from TP-Link and Netgear and all that stuff. And some of that stuff says it's managed, but the management is god-awful on that stuff. And if you're going to, especially if you're doing this at home because you want to either build a lab or upgrade your internet at home so that you're working with, you know, BSD firewalls and networking and trunking, you're going to want a Cisco switch and you're going to want to learn Cisco switch commands. What I also realized is that other brands of switching are like really close to Cisco. We had an HP switch that we were using in the interim as a backup because one of our switches died. Unplugged it, plugged it back in, and it never came back. There was some hardware failure. So I got this HP switch, and when I consoled into it, I was like, wow, that's like exactly like Cisco iOS. I really feel kind of right at home right now.
You could have gotten a Huawei and have been also right at home.
Is that the same thing?
Yeah, well, that was the, I don't know how true it is or not, but I believe it is that Huawei ripped off Cisco's source code years ago, and then
sure. And Cisco took it largely from BSD, although who knows what it is?
Yeah.
So I ordered some switches from eBay. So obviously, if you're in an enterprise, right, you've got a contract with either Cisco directly or a reseller. When we worked at Brown, we did the whole big network upgrade while I was there, which is a great experience to see all that gear come in and see all the costs and warranty and maintenance. I was in a lot of those meetings, and so I get it on the enterprise side. It's going to be very different. I was like, well, for our small network, I really want Cisco switches. I don't want to pay these things. 3560s, Joff and others retail for like $3,000, depending on the features.
They're not cheap.
They're like
even the used ones.
Even the used ones, legit used ones, not the ones that I bought. Legit used ones will run you $1,500 or so on Amazon.
So who'd you steal that from?
If you go to eBay, and there's a link in the show notes, and I don't know what kind of license violation there is because there's no support, there's no contract on them. And obviously these were like recycled from businesses that went out of business or Chapter 11 or whatever. Like I don't pretend to know where they're getting them from.
So they came from Yahoo.
Maybe they came from Yahoo's original network.
Altaba.
So these 3560s run me about $170 each. Wow. And so for that cost, I can buy a couple, and if one dies, I can have another one to swap in or whatever. Now, be careful. Don't make the same mistake I did because I've got a few more switches than I had originally intended. Big difference between a 3560 and a 3560G. 3560s or 10100
Yes, there
ports, right, Joff? Joff knew. I should have asked Joff.
Versus one.
Versus 48 ports, 10100, 1000 on the G.
800 meg, it's good enough, right?
But what's interesting, Joff, even after I had made that mistake, I was like, well, not everything needs gig. So, like, I threw one here in the studio, right? But they've got 4, I call them GBIC ports.
Yep.
I don't know, is that the right?
GBIC, yep.
GBIC.
That's what I called them.
Yeah, okay.
GBICs.
4 GBIC ports, and so you can put any kind of module that's supported by this hardware and software in there. You can get non-Cisco ones for $20 that support gig. I'll link those in future segments. So basically, I placed an order to put a whole bunch of gig ports in there. So I mean, you can port channel a couple of these gig to another switch and still have 2 gigabit or 3 gigabit ports on it, and then have your 10100 for other things. In the server rack, I did 2 3560Gs that are gig across the whole thing. I actually put 4 GBICs in each one, port channeled them, so there's a 4 gig connection between the switches.
I'm surprised.
In
you
the
didn't
closet.
put
Can
10
I
gig.
interject really
Yes.
quickly?
Please do, Jeff.
I just want to say I feel like I'm watching QVC right now.
Yeah. Well, I thought rather than pictures, Jeff, that I'd actually hold some stuff up for the
I'm not
camera.
saying it's a bad thing.
Okay.
I feel like I'm watching
Yeah.
QVC.
You need the
Keep
overlay.
going.
I
Showing
do.
the price channel.
Now, how
many
much would you
bidder-
pay?
I don't have any GBICs handy. I think I used everyone I ordered. I used the.
I'm
If you
surprised.
order now,
Yeah, right?
We'll throw in.
I'm
we'll
surprised
throw
you
in
didn't get
Ronco knives.
the 10 gig GBICs.
Those were a lot more expensive, and I for what I was. So I'm monitoring all those ports, and
Yep.
in subsequent ones I'll show you the Zabbix server. I'll talk about it on this segment, but I'll show you the Zabbix server.
It's all right. I get creds.
Yeah, what's that?
That's it. Don't worry. I get creds. You posted it in Slack like a week ago.
Yeah. So you can monitor all 4 ports, and like we're not touching the
Yeah.
the bandwidth on the interconnect, right? If we do, then I'll order a 10 gig one, swap it in, and be off to the races. So again, I don't know if I'm in violation of some kind of license by ordering these over eBay. There's no support contract on them. The manufacturer that sells them, I forget the name, they've been great to deal with, by the way. So the one that's linked to in the show notes, I've ordered a lot of Cisco gear from, and I've had great luck with them. In fact, this last time they sent me 1 switch, they're supposed to send me 2. I sent them an email and opened a ticket with them, and in less than an hour, they were like, "Oh my God, my bad. Here's the tracking number for your additional switch. It'll be there in the next day, maybe 2 the most." It came, and I was like, "Okay, that's cool." Like everyone makes mistakes. Like you totally like made up for it and fixed your mistakes. So they've been, other than that one little hiccup, they've been great. The gear has been good, except for the one that was running for a really long time, and then I unplugged it and plugged it. But this gear's old to start with, so know that going in when you buy a $170 switch from eBay, it's already got some mileage on it. So it may die, so buy a couple at that price point. Now, the nice part about this is I'm doing span ports, port channeling, and VLANs, which is, once it all came back to me, was pretty easy to read the docs. And now, it took me a while to relearn it. It had been some time since I had worked with it. It was pretty easy to configure and all worked nicely. I think they came with iOS 12.1 or 12.2.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question. If you need to do an iOS update,
then you need to
Find a
buy
friend.
a support contract
find a
or
friend.
find a friend with a support contract to get a
for those
newer
models.
operating
Yeah.
system. Yeah, these will support SSH. I configured SSH on them as well. I don't think they have the routing modules built into them, but I don't need the routing.
It's a switch,
It's-
not a
it's-
router.
it just I need a switch with a span port with VLANs and Ether channel, essentially, right? Because we got a Drobo that has 2 gig interfaces, so this is perfect, right?
Yep.
I don't know, Paul. With our earlier conversation, you might like the router.
Right, right. Now that you got me thinking, Joff, yes, I probably could use that.
But phone a friend. I think you have some friends. Just by the way,
Absolutely.
it's like,
And so, Paul, I had a similar problem in my home office that I needed a better switch in the office. But my requirements were a little bit different. I needed gig, multiple ports. I needed higher port density that I already had. I think I had 12 ports. I wanted 24 or 48. I don't remember which, because if I was going to grow, I was going to just grow bigger.
Sure.
The big one, because it was in my office. I sit here, the switch is here, fanless.
Yeah.
Had to be fanless.
These go in our server room.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
So,
whatever.
yeah,
If they're
yeah,
loud,
fan-
they're loud.
yeah.
I don't care.
I've-
that's my one complaint actually about Cisco switches. They are not quiet.
Yeah. I lived through the fan enabled era of my home network,
Yes.
as you remember. I had some single 1U Nokia devices that pfSense was put on them, and because they weren't running the Nokia OS, there was no fan control. And you could hear those fans with the basement door closed. On the second, they're in the basement at the bottom of the stairs. You could hear them on the second story of our house in the back.
Wow.
When it
It
was
was going
quiet
through
at
the whole
night.
ductwork.
Yeah. Couldn't you? Yeah,
Oh, no.
exactly.
Oh, no.
Exactly.
No, you could actually hear the sound come up the stairwell and up to the second floor.
But ductwork will. We had doing some soundproofing thing. Ductwork will carry sound.
Yeah.
Well, the fans, it's the noise. It's the first thing that's going to break. I'm sure it loves the cigar smoke.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, I didn't need as many ports. I think I have the 12-port, the SMC smart switches.
Yep.
Yep.
Is what I used at home, and it allows me to do the VLANs, the trunking.
Yep.
And it's fanless.
What I also like for Cisco is when I do segments on the show. I mean, Cisco's pretty standard.
no,
People can apply that to their.
The joke that I always heard was no one was ever fired for buying Cisco.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So the cabling is important. And I tell you, having the network that started at my old house where we started the podcast and then moved to my new house and then moved here and went through multiple iterations here, that, back when we started the pod 14 years ago, right? I mean, yeah, if it was Cat 5, it was Cat 5, right? Like our internets weren't 150 or gig like they are today. So it wasn't that important. So I was like, as long as the cable didn't look like it was going to fall apart in my hands.
Right, and the tabs were still on it, so it stayed plugged in.
Yeah,
because you had one of those.
I did, yeah. And then, so like cables were good.
Always break.
And then over time, I was like, no, we need to replace those cables. For a lot of, machines started becoming gig. The switches were starting to become gig. And I was like, okay, we should have gig cable. Even as recent as last week, I found what I believe to be the last Cat 5 cable plugged. I was like, how did that get there?
Nice.
So cabling is really important. The nice part is cables have come way down in price. So what I realized was when we did gig, one of the big problems was that my connection to a couple of units down where I was getting the gig connection, it was a Cat 5e cable, but there was an end terminated on it. On the cable, it comes out of the box that you're not really supposed to terminate an end directly to for whatever reason. Geoff could probably describe it better. That went to something else that punched down into a receptacle that wasn't really in. It was like dangling in the receptacle that another cable was plugged into, that was plugged into another cable with a receptacle that was plugged into a cable that had, the end on it. That would not negotiate gig no matter what I did. Did not matter.
You got 300 baud amazingly well, though.
Right? Yeah. And so I was like, well, I need to buy some. So you can buy cables. This one was like 100-foot Cat 6 cable. It's flat, and it comes with the little plastic things with the nails in it. And you get the whole kit. So you can run the cable. You can tack it up.
It's flat?
Do we have... there's one laying around here somewhere. I can show you after. I didn't bring one of the cables. But it's flat.
Flat? How does that work?
It's flat. I would imagine the pairs are twisted inside, even though they are twisted, right, Jeff, based on last week's conversation.
Yeah. Mike, how does that work? Because I know, we use those cables that stretch out and go back in.
Yes.
And they're flat, and they're not twisted.
Right.
And
this one is twisted. I have tested it with a cable tester, and I am pushing gig through it without issue.
I won't dispute it then.
So
just for clarity, though, Cat 5e will indeed carry gig quite well.
Correct. Absolutely.
It will not, however, as I discovered recently, carry 10 gig. Because
they do. Well, yeah. So there's Cat 6e or Cat 7. I mean, you could probably do it over Cat 6 as well. I mean, it depends on your distance and all that stuff.
You have to use a higher quality dilithium crystal. That's all.
That's right, and make sure your flux capacitor is tuned accordingly.
Right.
Exactly.
But is it all meet PCI?
I'm not sure of.
Is it PCI compliant? Yeah.
The same company makes Cat 7 cables, which they're not that much more expensive. If you're going to run a new cable, what I did in my house was I just ran a Cat 7 because when 10 gig comes around, the cable's already there, right?
Yep.
I ran Cat 11 in my house.
Cat 11.
Yeah,
huh?
we actually I can light speed communicate.
It goes to 11.
It goes to
When
Your
need a
dials
little bit
all go to
more
11. Your
internet.
It's sort of like
cables are all 11, Harry. We get it.
Remember when fiber to the desktop was the thing?
Right.
Yeah, that was weird.
last mile fiber.
So the other hardware that I'm using for my enterprise-ish setup here are Raspberry Pis, believe it or not. To do DNS and DHCP, I don't like to put that stuff on the firewall. And let me tell you, when you get to high availability and load balancing multiple WAN connections, you're going to really screw yourself with DNS and DHCP once you start getting to that setup. So best to take it off the firewall as early as you can. There's a lot of great benefits to that. So I actually have 4 DNS and DHCP servers. They're $50. I don't know. What are you paying for Raspberry Pis?
Yeah,
These days? I bought a kit for $50. It comes with the power connector, the case, the heat sinks.
SD card.
Does it come with an SD card? This one I don't think did.
$50 or $60 by the time you're done, depending on how large of an SD card you want. I mean,
Right.
I still have Pis that I'm using with modern Pi 3s with 8 gig SDs because I don't need a lot of storage space for a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
Or if I do, it's text.
I'd be curious to see like what the limitations are on performance and throughput with DNS and DHCP. Like what kind of, I know for here it's fine, right?
Yep.
But I'm like, we're not a gigantic network, and it works just fine. I'm using Pi-hole on some of them to do the blacklisting, black hole DNS kind of thing, which is really easy. The nice part is it's easy to set up. The bad part is it's not really all that. When you get into like the in-depth configuration, it's not as good. But it works just fine. As a caching DNS server and DHCP, it works just great. And they're $50.
I ran into a problem there, Paul. And that was I don't have a Pi-hole, but I have a manual version of that configuration. You and I worked on this.
Yep.
And my malware domains configuration file is 30,000 lines long, and that's running into bind. I'm just looking at it right now. And with 30,000 domains configured into bind and then running in memory, bind ends up taking up just shy of 1 gig of RAM. And so you have to be a little careful with your resources there, that you might run into challenges with a Raspberry Pi style solution. Mine's actually running on the firewall, but it depends how much you're doing with bind.
That's a great point. The other point too is the Raspberry Pis are ARM, and so you're going to be limited to what kind of software you can put on it. For example, we use one of our sponsors, actually, Qotom, for patching, and there's no ARM support, right? Largely because the enterprises probably don't have a lot of Raspberry Pis floating around.
Probably not using those.
Probably not using those, which I get it, and I get it. So probably looking to upgrade those to something else down the road, just to get better support from some of my other tools, which are actually used, like Qotom in the enterprise. So, but if you're looking to go on the cheap, you can have lots of Raspberry Pis. I find they work great for DNS DHCP. On to software. Has anyone else played with OPNSense and pfSense? Either of those two?
I've done a lot of pfSense. I have not gone full hog on OPNSense. I put it in a VM and played with it a little bit.
Sure.
That's about it.
It's
interesting.
interesting.
Not me. I built my own, so as you know.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the flame wars between the two projects. I don't know if the OPNSense developers did they work on pfSense originally? I haven't gotten to tracking down the network and security engineers at the respective projects and bringing them on the show. I am planning on doing that because I think it'd be a lot of fun. Not at the same time, although that would be it could be very wildly entertaining. But so I think some of I'm not sure what the decisions were in pfSense that sparked the community to fork pfSense and Moonwall to create OPNSense. Some of the things are pfSense did make an announcement, which is why I was using OPNSense. They made an announcement that as of version 2.5 of pfSense, they would only support hardware that had the AES-NI capability built into the chip. Yep. And largely that was for encryption, for encrypted communications of some encryption of some kind, right. Co-processing. And I actually thought that when they made that announcement a couple of years ago, that was a big deal. I'm like, this is the end of the world. Now, what I've realized recently is a few things. One, they have not released 2.5 yet. even though they said it was going to be released by now, it's not released. They also said, pfSense, that they'll support 2.4 for a year before they stop supporting it. So if you have non-AES-NI chipsets, which are cheaper, it's okay. Now, what's happened in the past couple of years is what happens with computing, right? The cheaper hardware now supports AES-NI. In fact, the firewall I linked to in there is $300. It's a Qotom device. It's an Intel i5 with AES-NI support in it. So not as big of a deal. The other thing I've noticed is that in a general sense, I find OPNSense, especially in their more recent release, and I even tried the next most recent stable release, is a little buggy. It's just, it doesn't seem quite as polished as pfSense in terms of maintaining state, the responsiveness of the interface, and some of the other features just seem more polished in pfSense, largely because Netgate is now the commercial company behind it.
Yep.
They sell commercial hardware and software. Their hardware that's comparable to some of the things I'm building is around $800 a firewall. So if you're going to have two, like we're planning, it's $1,600 for the commercial stuff or $600 for the not commercial stuff. So there's always that as well. They're both based, on BSD, so all of the BSD protocol. I think earlier we were talking about CARP, which is like their version of open source version of HSRP. There's a lot of great functionality, like I said, AO21Q trunking, all kinds of stuff that in terms of logging, and the graphs that they give you on it are awesome. NetFlow. There's just a lot of features in this open source software that you'd normally find in enterprise level gear, and here it all is in open source operating systems. The last piece of software that I had was Zabbix. Has anyone else played around with Zabbix? Have you ever do Nagios? Ever done Nagios before? Zabbix is pretty similar to Nagios. It's got a great community behind it, a lot of functionality. As with any monitoring platform, there's a learning curve, right? And having never used Zabbix before, it was pretty easy to get set up, but the tuning is a process. Like getting basic stuff, or you read the docs, you get the basic stuff, and then you're like, well, I want to make a graph for this, or it's a lot of reading and testing. And then you're like, I want this advanced feature that like pulls all the vulnerabilities from a vulndb and compares it against a package listing. That's a lot more setup and a lot more reading and all that. So there is a commitment, I think, in any monitoring platform. Zabbix was no exception. It is free and open source, which I'm actually pretty amazed. That's the Zabbix. Did I send you that screenshot, or did you hack into my Zabbix server, which is totally fine?
You posted it in the RC channel and told us to log in as guest.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
IRC Slack channel.
Yeah. I gave you guys access to it.
Yeah.
So having those graphs have just been awesome, especially as I work with the internet connections and the new switches. I can monitor every switch port, every firewall, see all the utilization graphs for traffic, make sure everything is flowing correctly, and that's all open source.
Can you set up it as alerting?
It does have alerting, very advanced alerting that I have not quite gotten to configuring completely yet. But yeah, it'll email, it'll text.
You can tell when the shows happen and when Paul surfs their porn.
That's when they post the shows. You can definitely see when the shows happen. Actually, it's kind of interesting. I didn't see a huge spike in bandwidth, right? Because it's not consuming a lot of bandwidth.
Right.
It's got a connection, and it's more about latency than it is about bandwidth when we have streaming the show out or remote guests or hosts on via Zoom or Skype. When we see a lot of bandwidth utilization, I realize is when we actually post the shows. I was able to cut that time down in the setup that I have that I'll talk about in subsequent segments. Policy-based routing is awesome, right? I've even gotten way more advanced with, you can have groups of gateways that are load balanced. You can have groups of gateways that are failover, and you can favor one connection or another in a group, apply those to a policy and say, keep this traffic with this group that favors this gateway and only switch to the other gateway if it goes down. So when we push shows, that system favors the gig link as opposed to the 150 link. So all kinds of fun stuff. Now I'll go into how to set all that up too. Actually, I overcame some issues. SSL traffic does not like to be switched between gateways at all.
No, it doesn't.
It does not, right? And it's weird because you're looking at your logs and you're like, SSL is really the only connections that are affected when gateways start switching around. And then you do some more reading, and I'll show you how to construct some policies that can help aid that so that you don't have that issue. But it hates that. So that was pretty much where we're starting. I didn't talk about the access points. I am using Ubiquity, Unify platforms. There's a lot of different options on there. You can do it with the cloud key or without, and I'll talk about how to set all that up because that's not really Ubiquity's great, but their documentation and setup is not as easy as some of the other solutions that are arguably more expensive. But the software is awesome on Ubiquity. The throughput is fantastic. They now tell you. I mean, before we used to have to set up Kismet and all these fancy wireless tools. Right in Ubiquity, it tells you how crowded the wireless channels are.
Yep.
So it'll be like, yeah, there's other activity there. It doesn't say access points, but there's other 2.4 gigahertz interference from somewhere, and then you can go move it, and it changes dynamically. I'm like, that's so much easier than breaking on a laptop.
So I was actually interested in that because I think Ubiquity is starting to definitely bring prosumer to play, right? To use the cliche word. Which I think is really interesting. I've actually got some Cisco access points in my house, but they're very much older and requires the ESX controller. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in looking at Ubiquity because I think that might be a good replacement solution.
Yeah, the controller for Ubiquity is just management software. The APs largely operate independently. Mm-hmm. The ones I buy are the light versions. They're like $80 for a dual radio, BG, N, and then AC, and they're $80. It's got a gig port, power over Ethernet.
Yep, I did similar. I did the Pro version with AC.
The Pro version is just more RAM and CPU, something like that.
I don't know.
I think.
Either way, but it was $135. Mm-hmm. And I have one.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. I'll have to get with you guys offline and get that stuff from you because I don't like the dependency on my ESX server right now because that makes my family bitch at me when it goes down. So
and we don't want the family complaining there's no Wi-Fi. There's riots to be had.
My son is convinced that the internet is destroyed if there's no Wi-Fi.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, so he's not wrong.
When I redid all the cabling and put the new AP in the house, it was actually the outdoor model with the actual physical antennas on it. And I just put it inside. Because I was like, well, there's a point at the top of my stairs on the second floor that's the perfect spot for an access point, and I can go up in the attic and literally just punch a hole through the drywall and drop a cable through. And so I put the one outdoor one, but it's got antennas on it, so I get great reception. I stood underneath it with my phone, and I got 100 meg up and 100 meg down, which is my internet capacity on my phone. I was like, okay, that's working pretty good. Yeah, done, my job here is done, right? So.
And if it rains,
so
it's still fine.
AC, AC is kind of worth it, right?
Yeah, I agree.
I was going to say, if it rains indoors, you're still fine.
Yeah, if the sprinkler. Well, I mean, I have 3 boys at home, so anything could happen in my house. Anything could happen.
The old sprinkle when you tinkle.
That, squirt gun, garden hose, all make their way inside.
Yep.
It's
water balloons.
Yeah, water.
Anything
exactly.
can and does happen.
Does happen. Which is nice. So. Yeah, that's the hardware that I'm working with. And again, I'm just really impressed as to the enterprise-ish kind of features that you get from all this gear. And again, you can put this together for under $1,000, have gig firewall, switching, access points, which is really pretty amazing if you're willing to put in a little work and learn how to configure it. Of course, there's other wireless systems, and Ubiquity has its own firewall. So you can buy everything from Ubiquity, which I've heard I've read mixed reviews. I like to go to their support page or their GitHub and look at the issues that are submitted for when they release software and see what problems people are having to kind of gauge how buggy or difficult the configuration is going to be. So, and that's how I came down to the config that we have in the show notes.
Nice.
So with that, we will take a short break, come back, talk about the security news for this week. Stay tuned.